Hey guys, it's Saturday, September 21st, and it's Tinderbox weekend again with Michael Becker. I'm Mark Bernstein, the designer of Tinderbox, and back from Poznan, Poland, where I was at the ACM Hypertext Conference. So, with respect to Tinderbox weekends, I'm a couple of weeks behind, and with respect to hypertext research, I hope I'm more or less caught up. And the paper on Gaudi View was, I think, really well received and much discussed. Uh, the poster paper was not, I think, very well understood, but on the whole, I really can't complain. Mark Anderson was also there, and in addition to his wonderful paper, his work as proceedings chair won universal praise. People were saying, like, best proceedings chair in 40 years. Certainly saved my bacon. Uh, and so you can find all these papers in the ACM Digital Library at acm.org. I'll have mine posted on my weblog, markbernstein.org, shortly. So I'm hard at work finishing Thinking with Tinderbox, which meant yesterday I went back to Harvard's main library for the first time since graduate school to pin down some details on a chapter on the design of the action language and the idea of designing languages, which is actually a really fascinating idea. Um, but this meant that I'm digging up books about Sumerian scholarship, and books on Sumerian scholarship, I find, tend to be books on paper. And to be honest, I've gotten rather out of practice in recent years with taking active Tinderbox notes from paper texts. So if you have thoughts, do put them in the forum or bring them up here. And without further delay, here's Michael Becker.
Actually, can we have a little bit more delays? So, like, what were the
Sure.
top three things that you learned at the event? And also, let's highlight, I guess Mark Anderson got in the running for Best in Show paper. Didn't make it this year, but at least he got recognized as having a really good paper. So congrats on that, Mark. So if I can hear from both of you what the kind of top three learnings from each of you were for the event, that would be great. What were your key takeaways?
Well, that's quite a challenging question, and also politically fraught. But I'll take a shot at it. Uh, One is that hypertext research as a field is actually coming back. For those who are coming in late, hypertext is research about writing with notes, writing with links. And so Tinderbox is quite firmly in that orbit. But there are lots of other things in that orbit. It was a very active research area in the 90s. It went violently out of fashion when it seemed that the web had solved all the problems. And if the web's solution was bad, it was like the QWERTY keyboard, here to stay anyway. More recently, the web has been coming back to Earth, and we're finding interesting ways to use web infrastructure in order to do things that we want to do. And remembering that the things that hypertext has always wanted to do involving complex textual structures is actually interesting and doable. So there's lots of tension between crazy new ideas and crazy old ideas that seemed out of reach but aren't. So that's one. That's a big one. Um, Mark, do you have something you would like to go with?
Um, no, except that I was reminded yet again that so at the moment there's been an influx of people from the digital humanities, which I think has been useful and has put all the Twitterology sort of firmly to one side. Well, also I think Mr. Musk didn't help the Twitterologists, but they're doing TikTok or something else. But it's interesting, but not generally informative to those who are interested in hypertext. Stuff about recommender systems is, cum si cum sub. But if you're really interested in the text and the issues surrounding sort of provenance and origin and this whole structure, so things that are innately hypertextual, remain as relevant as ever. And in recent years, there's been a conscious effort also to bring the sort of creative side of hypertext back. And my reflection on that is it's remarkably useful because I think it keeps the more technically oriented a bit grounded. So instead of dealing with the certainty of, you write code and stuff happens, or as we find when we occasionally write our own action code, we write stuff and it doesn't happen. But there is a sort of certainty or an expectation of a certain outcome that the more playful element of the people doing deliberately sort of transgressive and creative things with hypertext is remarkably useful in sort of keeping thought fresh. I'm also reminded that spatial hypertext has yet to have its day. Now, there are sort of two flavors of this in a sense, because there are the maps that we're used to in Tinderbox, which sort of descend from story space, which seems to be a parallel evolution of a good idea that is also seen in systems that have essentially a spatial parser built into them. And the sort of the remaining person keeping that alive is Klaus Atzenbeck and his team at Herf in Germany. I think that its time is yet to come, and hypertext is one place that's sort of keeping that alive. So I think it remains as relevant as ever. It's in Chicago next year, for those of you who are sort of the other side of the pond from me. But it's very interesting. I mean, my own rock in the pond this year was to politely point out that we've not been doing print for about 20 years now, where you can pick your boundary wherever you want. But what it's come, certainly when I started to look at this, what it's come as a brutal wake-up call for is just how much we depend on the nostrums of the paginated printed page to do a lot of things that now no longer have paper anywhere near them. Or we do things like page counts that are based on print cost or the number of quires needed to make up an affordable book. They're not wrong, but they're not actually serving us well, because one of the things they're not doing is making us think about appropriate replacements for things like page numbers. It's not that the books are going away, but in the future they probably won't be in the form that we're used to, like on the shelves behind me. So we really get with the modern world and look at that. That's a work in progress. Apart from that, no, I mean, as ever, it's a bit of an intellectual spar, and yeah, always enjoy getting to hypertext.
So can you provide a link for next year's event? And a link for where you can find the papers. I mean, I can go to acm.org, but if you can find a direct link to where we can download the papers.
The papers, I put a link in the chat for this year. I don't know how it goes. I think they're open for access during the conference, and then I think they go back behind the wall. Except now, a lot more are open access. ACM, like a number of publishers, is pivoting to open access, which basically means that the way ACM are doing it, that if you're a university that subscribes to the DLACM, now essentially by default anything that the first author of a publication, if they are a member of ACM Open, which is what it's been rebranded as, all the papers are open access by default, unless they choose them not to be, which would be an unusual choice. So the march is towards more open access. The challenge is underneath the sort of Sturm and Drang about authors and publishers having a go at one another about sort of unfair use or sort of free labor on the part of the authors. There is some cost in keeping this whole thing alive, and so I think ACM are sort of trying to work towards that. So Mark's just posted in the chat, it's available now. If you go to the link, I'll put it in again.
Yeah, because the Chicago one, I actually will be able to make that next year.
Well, the Chicago one is Mark, I'm spacing on where exactly in Chicago it is.
IIT.
IIT in Chicago. I don't think the website is up for it yet. It'll take a while. It'll probably wink into existence after Christmas. The themes and everything are yet to be decided. there was a quiet silence in the room when the incoming chair mentioned the word recommender systems. But we'll see. It's a broad church, and we welcome all. I see Chuck has his hand up.
What is Chicago? What is IIT, by the way? I'm not familiar with that.
Illinois Institute of Technology.
Okay. Mr. Chuck.
I was just going to follow up on Mark's comment about.
Before we dig in, everyone, if you've never been to one of these meetups before, the way we typically run them is we go around the room, we introduce the new people. We're here to talk about tools for thought, events, activities, services, just like we're doing right now. We then dig into a particular theme. If we don't have a theme, we then talk about whatever we want to talk about. And so today we're kicking off with the conversation around hypertext and such, and then we have some themes from the backstage that I'll bring back up. But at least that way we can orientate the people that may be wondering, well, why did I show up here? What video am I listening to? All right, now Chuck, go for it.
I was just going to follow up on Mr. Bernstein's comment about visiting an archaic structure called a library. And I've thought of, I haven't been to a library in quite some time. And I've also completely transitioned to doing everything electronically. And I can't imagine buying a book that isn't electronic anymore. But it occurred to me that if you were going to a library, and I was wondering about this, do they confiscate your iPhone or your Android device before you go in, but so you can't copy the pages out of the books? Is that an option for people trying to collect snippets of information from dead tree objects?
They do not. In fact, they have made subtle and exquisitely expensive alterations in the library to provide lots of plugs in for plugging in your laptop or whatever. And nearly everyone was using some sort of electronic device. And it was crowded, which it never was, 35, 40 years ago when, in my memory, this library's main reading room is built according to a turn of the 20th century imagination of the baths of Caracalla. I mean, it is a huge Roman vault, and it used to have like 2 or 3 people in it. And now there were multiple people at every table. And as I said, most of them had laptops. So that's interesting.
Yeah, I was getting at the idea that you could take your phone and capture pages of.
Yeah, I've been thinking about that. The other great surprise is that the successor to the card catalog, which is this online card catalog they were starting up 40 years ago, called Hollis, and now includes a periodical index. And I, at one point, had a reference that just made my heart sink. I copied into my paper notebook. It was anonymous, period. Excavations in Iraq, 1985 to 6. The journal's name is Iraq, volume 49, pages 47 to something. And I said, I really want to see the picture, but this is going to require at least a librarian and probably a domain specialist. Even then, it's going to be hard. And this is at Widener, which is a copy of literally everything. So, the great thing about this library, which in many respects is very unpleasant to use, is that if you want to chase a footnote, it's almost certainly in the stacks. But finding this was going to be impossible. But despairing, I did my good faith search. So I could tell the librarian, of course, it got nowhere. And result number 2 was exactly the article I wanted. And it had free electronic access. Okay, it was a horrible digitized PDF, but there it was. I didn't even have to get out of my seat. And like, I just knew that this was going to be a miserable adventure because it's like the sort of thing where if you type it into Google, you get Iraq, 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 Iraq. So digital librarianship is better than I had expected.
Awesome. All right. Anybody else? Any other topics? Fantastic. Okay. So what else do you, who's working on what? I mean, I've got tons we can discuss. Peter had a question, Mark, that you may be able to answer from a week or two ago is, what was your question, Peter? How can you find the reference of every book published or something like that? Like you're looking for how many books were.
Oh, I was trying to find out the total number of all books and papers published in all time,
Ooh,
just like an upward bound.
How
I
would you?
would take a look at the beginning of Adrian John's History of the Book, which might have that number as a throwaway in the first paragraph. And failing that, I would.
You muted.
Mark Anderson, did you catch that? Can you put the reference of that book he just mentioned in our chat? I missed it.
Yeah, Adrian John's History of the Book. And if that doesn't work, I'd get in touch with Professor Johns or some other historian of the book. It's a biggish field, but I've got no idea how you'd count, and it's going to be hard to count exactly.
Is it the nature of the book, Print and Knowledge in the Making, or is that something else?
I'll put the citation in as soon as Bookends comes up.
Thanks so much.
Sorry, Michael. The only one I've got by him, by Johns, is his book on piracy,
Yeah.
Which is quite interesting too. It's really about copyright, but the title is piracy.
Awesome. Yeah, the nature of the book. Got it. Sweet. Okay. Anybody else? Otherwise, we can dig into some themes. I can show some really cool stuff that I was working on last week. And then we had a question from the forum, which if we're all interested in kind of rolling up our sleeves and ideating on the concept, the question was, what would be the best way to do qualitative data analysis with images in Tinderbox? And I had some thoughts about that, and I thought it would be fun if we just opened up a blank file and pulled in some images and thought about how might we go about that process. So if you're all interested in that, we could do that. But before that, I want to show you some fun stuff too that I figured out this week. Unless anybody else has any other agenda that they want to tackle today. Mr. Anderson, doing research for another task. I was reminded that one's on. Okay, cool. All right. So what do you all think? What would you like to tackle? Want me to just dig in and run the show? Okay, so let me show you my fun stuff. So as you know, I've been, it'll come as no surprise, I'm writing a book. And I've been struggling with several ways of automating and performing this. And one of the things that I came across, which was really interesting, was before it kind of some backdrop on this, in working with my publisher. You know, they are very, very editorially research constrained. They're struggling with their audience, which is both students and teachers. And as someone that's looking to, and let me stop sharing screen mode before to set this up. So as someone who's looking to forward the field and really put the most comprehensive suite of information about a particular topic together, and yet having to cater to an audience that says, look, like the students don't want, I've been very point blank, students don't want to read more than 30 pages, 50 pages. So you can't give them a 100-page chapter on a topic, even though that's what it would require for them to thoroughly understand and be competent in the topic. The other thing was the publisher is, even though all of their medium is in digital, they are struggling with the editorial process, because the way they go about doing the process is they've defaulted to the lowest common denominator of all material has to be put up in a linear document in a Google Doc that the author doesn't have actually editorial, but only comment rights to, so that you end up with just this giant, like, red-lined mess. And their whole idea is they want you to be writing in that format. But I'm trying to tell them, as we were talking about earlier, this whole idea of writing in this linear document and not writing with links and not writing with association and not writing in a format that allows you to move stuff around completely kills your thought-provoking process. So I'm dealing with a situation where, they want to consolidate the information, prematurely consolidate the information before the thoughts and the ideas have really been percolated. They want to limit it to 30, 50 pages, because part of it too is not only do the students not want to necessarily read more material than they have to, they're also catering to teachers who don't want to adjust their lesson plans. So they're like, you need to not change the book too much, because the teachers have already created their lesson plans, and God forbid we make the teachers go back and actually have to change the lesson plans. So it's a really interesting conundrum and dynamic. And I ended up hitting on something really, really kind of cool that I found helpful for me in, as the author, having to cater to kind of to this dynamic. And let me show you that. And then before I do that, I wanted to show you one other thing too. And now we'll dig in. So, and Mark Anderson, you and I talked about this on Thursday. Do you recall any more that from our conversation on Thursday? Because you had some really salient points about that.
About the book?
About the whole publisher, book, process, print.
Well, it partly sort of ties back to the sort of provocation I mentioned earlier. We ought to be a bit more mature about accepting we're not in printland anymore.
Yeah.
So, I mean, to a certain extent, for anyone who's in the publishing things, you need to be on the bus or you're going to be under it. So you can hang on as long as you like to the way you did it 200 years ago, but it's not going to serve you well in the future. And one of the considerations now for writing is probably to pivot your writing, so you write for the electronic form and you produce the book form as a distillation from it.
Right.
I suspect a big problem people are having is that they're thinking as the sort of electronic form as the extended form of the book, which is probably what we did 20 years ago. But it's a broken metaphor, because if you write for the digital form and for new spaces like extended, XR, sort of VR, you need much better structure, much better close addressing in your underlying document. You can still pull a nice linear narrative out of it, but that's the kind of thing you want to do on the back end. If you build a linear narrative first, you've basically broken the model to start with. And that's not as radical as it sounds. It's partly just, the way you look at the problem. But I'm imagining a lot of people in publishing are A, not very technically capable, and B, aren't really looking for change.
Yeah. So on that note, that reminds me of something else. Let me share with you all this before I get into that. So last week I gave a keynote for the startup marketer, and they asked me to kind of whip together my thoughts on the idea of the 5 C's of knowledge management, as we've been talking before. And I won't give you the presentation, but I want to highlight a few slides on this. And one of the kind of key points that I was coming across with that is I was trying to emphasize to them, like, the problem that we, when we all work in output software, we end up constraining our knowledge right out of the gate. So if we're creating in this output software, linear documents force us into thinking, Spreadsheets force us into tabular thinking. Presentation tools force us into bulleted thinking. Mind mapping as standalone tools force us into mind mapping thinking. What you really want is to be able to tease these apart. And this is what I've learned from us working in Tinderbox. And what all of this kind of constrained, bounded, prematurely bounded thinking does to us is we lose productivity, efficiency, insights, knowledge, creation, impact, the ability to create assets, and the overall reward from the thinking process. I'll skip that one really quick. And so what I was thinking about is, you all know I think about my five C's process, and I talked about how we collect notes. We then go through this processing of curation, collaboration, and creation to ultimately generate our outputs, our contribution. And so then I was kind of thinking about then what have I learned from all of you as we've kind of been going through this effort, and this is what I'll be about to demonstrate to you in my when I actually show you my Tinderbox file, is what I'm now labeling my CSA separation model. And that's simply to kind of say that we need to take back control and break the bonds between content, structure, and appearance. And so if we think about it, and this is what I've learned and what Tinderbox avails me of, and I've yet to find any other software, maybe Obsidian a little bit, but Obsidian I find too hard to get to the output part for me personally. But so you create your content, which is essentially your note. Your structure and appearance are the HTML and the CSS and all of the way the bulleting lists, all of the ways we want to structure that. And if you think about it, structure and appearance is essentially our design efforts, our UI and UX activities. So you've got your content, structure, and appearance. When you put content, structure, and appearance, when you put content and design together, you end up getting your contribution. You get your output. And then when you have your output, that output then can be distributed as a customer experience, CX, through any number of different channels. And then as I've been thinking about this kind of way of helping marketers think about this, if you start teasing this apart and you start being able to create a tremendous number of really powerful assets and capabilities for yourself, I started overlaying this with my product management hat, my software development hat on, and I started realizing, well, content's essentially your data layer. The design layer is essentially your presentation layer, which consists of presentation and experience. Your contribution is kind of your output layer. It's the application that you're going to be delivering, or excuse me, your application layer. It's that application that you'll be giving people, and then you're going to distribute that application through your delivery layer through your channels, whether or not that be a keynote presentation, a book, a PDF, a podcast, conversations like we're having right now. So I thought I'd kind of share with you a little bit where my thinking's been going and how I've been leveraging Tinderbox to implement this structure. Let me pause there and see if anybody has any gut thought reaction, or just think that's kind of an off the crazy idea. Yeah, Bill?
Well, so for my personal project, I've thought about these words which you've mentioned before, and that's the whole idea behind LaTeX, to separate structure from content. But in my lab notebook, I have lists. I did 1, 2, 3 steps 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 today for my experiment. And so I have a list. And in order to do that, I think the way you're suggesting here, it's taking it to an extreme. I'd have to have a separate note, I think, for every item on my list, and then some attribute that somewhere else that turns it into a list. And so the idea of, so for me, I just put an ordered list in my note. So I'm purposely and I'm deliberately mixing the content with structure in that case. So whereas I like the idea in general, I don't see, it's not an absolute statement, because I think in my case, that specific case, I want to mix structure and content in the same note. So I get the idea, but then I'm breaking the rule in what I'm doing.
Well, and by the way, I break the rule all the time too. But for me, the big part for me is what I've been learning is, and often what I'll do in the earlier stages, I will break the rule and I'll pull things together. But then as my thinking evolves and as my knowledge evolves, I'll find that there are some atomic assets that come out of that that are worthy of being broken out. And that's, call that the atomic note, the Zettelkasten process, all of that. So that over time, if I start seeing something that's repeated in a list, maybe that's worthy to be broken out as a standalone item so that it can be transcluded into other material when it's when it's there. So content for me, a lot of this data layer, a lot of this content strategy is for reusability. And then the more and more I get good with my Tinderbox files, even like this morning, once I get some of my own embedded patterns in the way I think about my work and workflows, I can start copying and pasting really complex action code structure, appearance, content back and forth between different files, and it just works. And I'll demonstrate that in just a second. But I totally hear where you're going with, Bill.
Okay, so we're on the same page.
Yeah, for sure. And then the other thing I kind of started grokking on when I was thinking about this is the content's a lot like the DNA. It's like the 4 strands of your DNA. And I can't remember the names of them off the top of my head. But using that analogy, it's like matching text, images, audio, video. And then when you start interlinking these with that DNA strand, you start getting actual DNA strands. You get posts and articles and reports. And then from a marketer perspective, if you do that well, you then can use this methodology then to like have life with people. You can connect, then communicate with them, and then ultimately as a marketer, you can conduct commerce with them. And so this process that I've learned from Tinderbox really is about producing life, producing insight, having a life through this process of translating the building blocks of knowledge life into this experience. And I don't want to take that analogy too far yet. One day I will, but for the sake of today, this is kind of what I've been thinking. And there was another hour or two about this. And what I was trying to explain to people is, as you all know, in my world of identity and data, the criticality of learning this type of thinking now is so crucial because this is where the world's going. When we think about self-sovereign identity, when we think about attribute data management, when we think about the future of data systems, it's important to start thinking this way because that's really the way our identity management, the way our data infrastructure is going, the way as we all roll out and get these national digital self-sovereign identity models into our hands, which is something we can't talk about in detail today. Learning this and thinking about life through this lens, I think is going to become critically more and more important for everyone down the road. So that's some of my thinking on there. And this will give you a backdrop now when I show you some of the work I'm doing. Let me pause there. Does that make sense? Okay. Yeah, we're good. All right. Oh, by the way, while I got it up, I'll just show you this. I did a quick look on SRN today. And in the Cybersecurity, Privacy, and Networks e-journal, since it's up, I'll promote it. My dissertation is top 4 in the last 60 days, which is kind of exciting. So I'll drop that in the chat. So we have that as a, I didn't intend to say that, but since the browser screen was up, that's kind of fun. And again, it would not have happened were it not for Tinderbox. Okay, so let me go and show you what's happening with the book. So I called it old for now, but oh yeah. So here's the new chapter I've written in Tinderbox, and gone at great lengths to go through this process of writing my notes. And again, all of what Bill's comment, I want to be really clear on this. I was able to write this 100-page chapter on mobile messaging probably in about 2.5, 3 weeks, give or take, as I was doing my other work. And much like you were saying, Bill, a lot of it started with cramming all of the ideas into one note. And then as the thinking evolved, I started teasing it apart and breaking it apart and moving it apart. And some really interesting concepts came for me throughout that process. So for example, if we dig into this area called mobile ecosystem, I'll just show you the output. When I render the output, that will come up and show you. Oh, and I've got some, again, here's a perfect, because I was demonstrating this earlier. here's a perfect example of here's the output of all of these children notes. But you'll notice here, I'm getting a bulleted list. Well, the reason why I'm getting that bulleted list is I was demonstrating to someone earlier that once you've set up your attributes and you've appropriately set up your templates, I can change the output. I can change the structure and appearance of my output on demand. So by unchecking these Booleans, which essentially tell my template, no, 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 don't demonstrate this as a linear document, demonstrate this as a bulleted list. When I now uncheck those and I render it, you now go from a bulleted list to this more long form linear document thinking. So one of the insights that I've encountered as I'm using Tinderbox is, I can use all of and in my early, this is really more mature thinking. So in the earlier stages of my thinking with Tinderbox, I'll use a lot of the Tinderbox built-in tools, table, hyperbolic view, tree maps, all of that. But as my thinking gets more and more mature, I'll either grab a poster that someone's created to help me manipulate output for myself, or to facilitate my thinking, I will create my own views using HTML. And such as a bulleted list, or such as a SWOT analysis table, things like that. So what I've learned too is the Tinderbox tables aren't just for publishing my output. They're actually also, or no, I shouldn't say Tinderbox tables. The Tinderbox templates aren't for me for just publishing my output, but they're also there for me to be able to create my own views of my data. So even if this output never leaves and go to somewhere else, if I feel like I need to visualize my data, my notes, that underlying information, and give myself a new structure to be able to interpret what I'm doing, I can just whip out some HTML and there it is. So I find that really, really powerful as I think through and doing this. So a couple of things that we learned that we've learned in this process as we think about atomizing the data. So what a lot of people will do, and there's nothing wrong, is you can just go ahead and paste a picture. Like, let me just grab it and show you an example. So let's say you're taking your notes and somewhere out there you found this picture. This happens to be one I generated from Canva, and you take your notes and you were to happen to paste that into a Tinderbox file like that, right? Perfectly acceptable. No reason why you wouldn't want to do that, other than the fact that, for me at least, and Bill, here's a great example of using your method. You've got your notebook. You're collecting data about that assignment or that research project you're doing, and you've got this note, and you're keeping it, all of that effort constrained into one place. And in the collection stage of the process, that's awesome, and it really works, and it's fast, and it's efficient. And likewise, you could do something similar where, like, I'm taking my notes for today's call using Obsidian on the side. You could do something similar, and by doing that, I've now pasted that note into my Obsidian file, and Obsidian has now created a markdown note with that image in it that I can go later recover. So that process is really useful. Let me pause there real quick. Peter, you want to ask your question?
Yeah, I was wondering if Bill's notebook template's publicly available.
Bill?
I'm not that advanced. So right now my only template is as we've talked about in the past, is getting what's in my Tinderbox notebook printed so that I can put it on paper in my paper lab notebook. But I don't have anything beyond that at this time. So it's not public. It can't be at this time.
No worries. Okay. So as I was thinking about it, and this is where Mr. Anderson really helped me out a ton, and as we think about the nature of the way this is going apart, what I learned is, this is an image that I want, but I don't want this image landlocked in this particular note, because I actually want to be able to reuse it. And I very well may want to link it to other notes, and I very well may want to use it in other projects. So with that in mind, let's not include the image there. What we actually want to do, and let me just do this so I can find it. What we actually want to do is, and actually, while I'm at this too, Mr. Bernstein, this gives me something I want to show you, and maybe this will stimulate some development creativity for you. What I actually want to do is create that note over here. Its name is this, and its image file name is this, and that file name is out on my hard drive as this. So I can create a path to that note. And what using and leveraging and riffing off of Mr. Anderson's work from a few months back, where he was creating footnoting strategies, what he and I just figured out is that we could leverage his footnoting effort to do what I'm going to show you right now. And I was able to implement his footnoting strategy. I think what did it take us less than an hour to kind of convert it. It took maybe a few days of thinking about what I wanted to do, but actually implementing it took less than, and honestly, to implement it, once I understood what Mark taught me how to do, it took me less than 15 minutes to implement, and I'll show that to you in a second. So, but here's the strategy. I started out with like Bill's approach of consolidating it all into one note, getting my thinking into one note, getting my ideas into one note. But then as those ideas matured, and as I found that those ideas were starting to develop, asset level material, I could then start breaking it out into its individual elements. So now I've got this note out here as an image that I now that it's a standalone image, I can find it, it's labeled, it's tagged, I can rediscover it in the future. It's now imminently repurposable because I have the same prototypes, and I'm using similar. I've gotten used to using similar attribute naming across my Tinderbox files. I can copy this file and paste it into any of my other projects, and it just works. And if it doesn't, then it's a minor tweak, and I make it happen. So there's all these really great affordances that reusability I get by breaking my notes up into their atomic pieces. Another critical concept that came on mind of that is in the area of collaboration. So what I ended up finding was when I started collaborating with my co-author for the book, we initially started saying, let's create an image called the figure in the mobile ecosystem. And then when I copied that over to her Tinderbox file, that worked fine. But what happens if I decided I want to change the name of the note from the mobile ecosystem to the mobile ecosystem revisited or new? Well, that would break any transclusion linking that I'll demonstrate to you in just a second. So because if you like the way the inclusion operator works is you paste in the note's name, and then Tinderbox goes and grabs the note named that thing and pulls it in. But what happens if you have a note that's got the same name, the mobile ecosystem? Or what happens if I change the name of that note? That creates, that would break that inclusion linking process. So I initially started with the idea of, well, what I'll do is I'll uniquely name each note with its ID number, which worked great until I started collaborating with my partner. Because when I copied the note from my file over into hers, I have a methodology that automatically changes the name of a note based on its note ID. Because that also helps with making sure export is consistent. Well, in doing that, when I copy her note back, that doesn't work anymore because I've now got the same image with two different note names with different ID numbers. So that broke. And so what we ended up doing was we developed a methodology I'll show you in my team media file. We developed a methodology of when I visit that note in media, what we do is I create a ID media name called FID media, and now that becomes a persistent, non-changeable identification string for that particular note. And then you'll see when I get down into the process, I actually change the note name, make the note name equal to the prefix image or video to that new attribute ID media. So now that I've got that, once I've created that note name once, it's now got a unique persistent identifier that I can now copy and paste around across any of my Tinderbox files. And as long as I keep my same workflow and I keep my same process, and my collaborators do too, we can now copy and paste notes and asset notes across all of our Tinderbox files. We can use the inclusion methodologies across all of the Tinderbox files, and it just automatically works. It's really, really cool. It took us a while to kind of get to that. But it just works. It works fantastic. And now I've got reusability of assets across all of my files with consistent naming structures and such. So I know I just spewed out a ton, but let me pause there and just kind of, does that generally make sense to people? Or any questions about that methodology before I show you the next step? Mr. Bernstein, I saw you nodding your head a little bit. Do you have comments or thoughts about that?
Yeah, I see what you're doing. I have to admit that I would be happier in general to have the name be something that's more communicative than F1372665. And it's clear that ID string is not catching on, and that's a problem. And I probably have to reconsider ID string.
Yeah.
And something I put in the forum, this particular display of all of the figures might look even better if you were using table view and had columns for things like not showing the title, and I forget what it is in the parens.
The parents is an appendix from give me an image from my display attribute that shows image count of children, but in this context it doesn't make sense. So that's like old code that slipped in and I've not bothered to fix. Yeah. And I agree with you. The reason why ID strings stopped working for me, and maybe you fixed it. I don't want to say fixed it. Maybe you considered this later. The original implementation of ID string included things like like characters that didn't work for the note name in output, like a backslash or a forward slash. There were things that were making their way into the ID string that was breaking my other.
It's just forward slash.
Right. So that's why I kind of gravitated away from that too. And how I get around for me, because of my proclivity, I'll call it dyslexia, ADHD, and as you all know, my proclivity to heinous typos. By using this, I'm not going to interject typos into the name, and the name is automatically generated. So as opposed to me as a human interjecting something that will go into the code and break it. This allows me to have something that gets automatically generated, and I'm, as a human, I'm not going to break the automation that I need in the system. And then that also then allows me to change the caption for the different notes that I want to have in a really effective way. So that is kind of why I went about that methodology. Now, kind of let me show you the automation I've developed. So let's say I'll just randomly grab one of these figures. So if I grab this figure name now and copy that to the clipboard, I can now go back to a particular note and say, in this space here, what I want to do is I want to now include the note with that name in this place. And so I've got text expander installed, and I'll say include figure, and then that will automatically copy. So what text expander is doing is I've got a text expansion snippet that says whatever's on the clipboard, wrap it with this code. So what text expander is doing is it's giving me an anchor tag. It's giving me the include with the appropriate media temp file I want. And then it's doing this do macro. And what the do macro is doing is it is export. What the do, and this is what I learned from Mr. Anderson. Thank you very much. What this do macro is doing is it's triggering an action that's essentially looking up at the section header of the document and helping me automatically configure the figure numbering for that particular figure. And so I won't go into the details and deconstruct it now. We can certainly do that later if we want. But by doing this methodology, what this does is this allows the Tinderbox file to be able to now not only insert that image, but also automatically label the figuring of that image within the context to where I happen to put it. And so anytime I move it around, the figure numbering gets automatically reconfigured. So that is pretty awesome. So If I now render this, if I go ahead and render this note, you'll see now I've automatically stuck in the appropriate notes. And in this context, the figure numbering is off, because for preview at this point, I don't care. Because I know for a fact that once I actually go and update that image based on my templates, I've got it in the background of the templates. It will give it a second. And you'll see now the main header template is set to, when you actually go render the entire book, reset the figure numbering so that when you actually go through the entire document, you'll see that the figure numbering just automatically changed itself. And so I can now, when I'm like doing my work, I don't worry about, is the figure numbering correct? Because if I go do that again too, you'll see the figure numbering's off again, perfectly fine, don't care, because I now know when I actually go to my actual final time of I'm going to output this, my templates automatically cascade through, and the way the do commands are set up in coordination with the templates, all of that automatically gets fixed. So that's a really cool way, and just kind of riffing back on what Bill was saying. And when I'm in that early kind of research data collection stage, I'll do exactly what Bill does. I'll throw it all into one place. I'll organize it out. As the thoughts evolve, I'll start breaking them up in themselves into their atomic notes, atomic assets. I then can use the include functionality in my automatic naming structure to be able to do that. And similar to that, I've also done that for the ability to interject tables. So I can use that same methodology for interjecting tables into my notes. And I've done that same technology for interjecting videos. So for example, let's say I grab this one. And I will go, and for the lack of better place, just demonstrate the same thing. I can go in here. In this case, I'm just going to type include that. And I know the template I want to use is T Media 1. That. So now I said, now let's say I've got this image here, and then I've got this video file that I want to be able to repurpose across places. So now if I show that, what that T Media 1 template is doing is it's saying, grab the text of that particular video note, prepend it with a little play icon in the document. So then when that person clicks on that,
codes because
it will pop up and show
verify.
We do know that billions of texts are sent to short codes every year.
So now I have the ability to then intermix, call to actions to go watch a video with the images in my documents, and that's been really, really fun to figure out and do too. So that's one thing that I was doing. Let me pause there. Anybody else have any thoughts, comments, questions on that? All good? All right. So
I'll just throw in one thing that one of the things that was sort of unlocked and was sort of shown in passing in when you were showing the macro was when the penny dropped that in a macro, you can actually use the caret action. So you can now shoehorn much of the power of action code into what started life. It was, macros go, I think, right back to the dawn of Tinderbox, and you don't see them out in the wild very often, but they do provide a way that you can basically put some code inline in the text of a note and basically have it disappear by the time it goes for export. There's always a choice here. Sometimes you're going to see things in the text that you might not want to see, but if your aim is that the primary reading space is in the exported form, then it seems a reasonable accommodation to have a small amount of export code where it needs to be done. And because the action code is hidden in the macro, the call to the macro can be quite short. So it's really quite elegant once I found that corner.
Yeah. And I remember when we were on a call, like, I wonder if that's going to work. And we did it. We're like, holy crap, it works. This is awesome. Right. So, and here's an interesting thing. So going back to my CSA, separating content from structure and appearance strategy, one might look at this and consider that as structure because I'm inputting like HTML code and all that, but I don't look at it that way. I see it as content, right? So in this method, I'm essentially putting structure into the note for the purpose of rendering content specifically within the context of this particular note, naming, I can, call it a table or figure and give it the appropriate numbering. So that was really exciting to do. One other thing that I'll demonstrate that Mark and I figured out last week was also while I'm writing this whole idea, and we've been over this ad nauseum constantly, but I'll share it with you again. As I'm writing, I use a term methodology. So when I'm doing my writing, and this is not just for writing the books, it's also for my own deconstructing of my own thoughts. It's also for me helping myself to learn the terminology of things. So what I was able to do is, so as I'm doing my writing, I'll say, you know what? I haven't defined the connected individual. I haven't defined the term endpoint. So I'll go ahead and stick that in the term. And as we've demonstrated before, and Paul, Christy, I'll be sending you this code later. As you all have seen me do before, I have the tool, I have Tinderbox automatically go and create that note if it doesn't already exist, which then allows me to then quickly, come up here. And in this case, I haven't defined the word terminal yet. So I'll just go ahead and define that real quick. So I can add some lorem ipsum text. In this case, I don't want to waste our time defining it properly. I close it. I now have that note defined. I can close it and I can move on with my work, but I'm defining that term within the context where I'm currently happy to be writing about it. What that then does for me as well, I then have an agent that's running. Peter, I use Text Expander and I dropped a paragraph of lorem ipsum text in Text Expander. So that way, whenever I want to drop placeholder text, I just do / lorem, and that's Text Expander just dropping in my lorem ipsum paragraph that I created. Okay, so and I find that just really helpful too for practicing. So this is a fun thing that I've done in the chapter too, and then I'll ultimately get to you cycle back to what I was happening with my publisher. So I then have Text Expander, an agent that's saying, go and look at, item index agent contains names. So where does that come from? I have the agent saying, go look at the project, which is defined as this chapter. Go collect all the descendants of that note. Because I use prefixes in my note names, name that note term hyphen the name of the term that was in that it's just collected. And what that does is that tells Tinderbox, go find all of the notes with that name. And so now that allows me to create my glossary of terms, which is really, really wickedly cool. And so then then I've got a template. When I render the glossary of terms, it gives me my glossary of terms. So that's kind of fun, and that works out really well. Now, what was interesting in doing that was the next piece that we struggled with and that we came up with last week is I created a methodology, an agent, and I'll just show it to you real quick, and we can share it later. But and I do because I got so much moving on. I only have my notes update on Stamp or with agents. I created this note that says, if you're an alias, go grab the index items from the original note. And the way I create that index item is I say, hey, term list, if you're not an alias, go look at all your outbound links and create an index. And then if you are an alias, then what I want you to do is look at your notes index. I want you to then look at and then I have the chapter. If I scroll back up here, I have the chapter index all of its notes. So this item here at the chapter level is saying, here's the ID for every note in this chapter. So then what's happening there in this context is I'm saying, where's the stamp again? What I'm saying is, okay, so I know all of the items that this particular term is linked to. I know all of the items that are actually in this chapter. So then what I want you to do is do an intersect for me. So that only shows me for this term which notes are related in this chapter, because I might have that term show up in other chapters and I might not. So what this intersect operator allows me to do is say, only give me the notes for that term that are showing up in this particular chapter, chapter 4. And then I don't need my logging anymore. That was just for testing. And then what I want you to do is I want you to link those notes that you've defined the link type glossary. So what that allows me to do now is if I go back now and look at my glossary, I can go and see that this, and so what this essentially does is that this alias note is linked to as a glossary to the introduction in this chapter. This alias note audio messaging is linked to the audio messaging section as a glossary item in this chapter. And that way, and Bluetooth low energy is showing as a glossary item in section 5.2.1 in this chapter. And in chapter 7, if I use Bluetooth low energy, again, for whatever reason, it will show up in chapter 7 as 7. Blah, 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 and become a glossary for that note. So this then allows me, as I'm going through and reviewing my glossary terms, I can quickly go back up here, maybe see how it works, redefine it, talk about it a little bit more, and then use the command apostrophe to go back and forth between those notes and refine my editing. So this, and this is something that Mr. Anderson kind of helped me debug on, and it turned out I actually had it 95% of the way there, but just spending 20 minutes, 30 minutes with Mark, talking through my thinking, creating an independent file to debug the process, we found that I had a couple things, syntax problems, and I had a couple typos. And then voila, this now works. And so having that collaborative partner just to talk through your thoughts and ideas is just immensely valuable. So thank you, Mark. I wasted days figuring this out, and within 30 minutes with Mark, I was able to get it fixed. So that glossary methodology worked out really, really well. So then here's where the kind of coup de grace with this thinking really works. So I'm all excited. I've created this 100-page chapter. I think it's awesome. I think it's comprehensive. I've got images. I've got thoughts. I've got ideas. Oh, and I'll show you one other thing I did this week too. That's pretty cool. So as Mary Beth was suggesting a couple weeks ago, she's like, oh yeah, but you all have to remember, we're not creating a course or a book. We're not writing a book. We're writing a course. And in a course, you not only have the material you want your students to read and your glossary terms, but you also have all of the lecture material. You have the assignments that you're going to be assigning students. You have the exam that you'll be giving the students. I'm sorry, Mark, what was the got that to reference?
Sorry, this is about the last issue about base64 encoding of ID and ID string.
Got it. Okay, good. And then you also have a textbook, a test bank, and you've got questions that you use and do. And this was really fun for me. So I took I didn't have time, and honestly, why not? Because it's public, and I don't mind it being public. Well, I took the entire chapter that I wrote and uploaded it to ChatGPT. And then I said, hey, ChatGPT, let me show you this. This is cool. Can you give me 5 single answer, multiple choice questions for my students on the book, and 5 true or false questions. Okay, so it's reading the chapter, and then it says sure, and spits out my 5 multiple choice questions and answers. Okay, and then what's here? Let's stop it real quick. I didn't prompt it well enough because I want the correct answer to have an asterisk. Please give the correct. Please. Answer and provide the section reference with an explanation. Where this answer. Okay. So let's see if it comes back. It's all about prompting. Okay, so you'll see here now, it actually put an asterisk at the end of the correct answer. And then it gave me a paragraph saying explanation block, section 3, blah, 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 section 4. So it's all about finding that appropriate prompt that you're looking for. So there are my 5 multi-choice questions, and here are my 5 true or false questions. So let's let it spit it out itself out. And and it's ChatGPT. It's not 100%. It's not always correct, but it's close enough. And as the author, I can work it. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this. And now in this note here, let me just delete that shit here. So in this note here, I just say temp file, and I paste that as unformatted text. And I don't need that there. Okay, so now if you look at what I asked ChatGPT to give me, it gave me a pretty rudimentary pattern for every question. There's some spacing in the front. There's this bullet here. There's the asterisk for what the correct answer is, and then there's the explanation of the notes. So then what I did using Tinderbox, as one is apt to do, I created a string parsing string that basically says, go through the book, follow that pattern, and give me my question. So now if I go ahead and apply that, Tinderbox quickly goes through the book, grabs the question, gives me the answers, makes the correct one green, flags it as is correct. And I now have all of my questions. Right. So, and on this one, it broke a little bit because the pattern's a little bit off. So then I'll tweak the code a little bit. But now I took what would have been hours and hours of work down to like 5 minutes. And then because I broke it all up into their atomic concepts, these are now questions I can reuse. These are questions I can remake. It links to the section of the book. So I'll actually, there was a little bit in this Julia Child show that didn't work. So I'll show you. If I go down here, it tells me what section of the book that was in. It puts the explanation in the body text of the system. So now later when I create the lecture, when I upload this to a CMS system, it will actually, once the student actually takes the question, it can present the right answer with the section answer. And because it's all broken into the system, I'll actually have the production ready HTML that I can actually upload right into my college's CMS system or whatever learning management system I happen to be using. And if I want, it doesn't have to be exported out as HTML. I can export it out as a CSV file and upload it right into the LMS. So wickedly cool. So that was the other thing I played with last week. So here's what ended up happening. I'm terribly excited. I've written all of this material. It's wonderful. And then I end up having a meeting. What's that icon? Oh, rocket ship. That's pretty cool. What I end up having I end up having to call with my publisher like, Becker, you're brilliant. This is awesome. We love it. But guess what? We don't care. And we're going to fall back to our students only want 30 to 50 pages. The professors don't want to change the book too much. Everything you're done here is fantastic. But guess what? We can't have it for this year's release. We got to have it for next year's release. And because our editorial staff's out there, we don't have the budget for it. It's not aligned with our expectation. All of the things that are great and fine and part of the human condition and the alignment of doing project work and all of that. And the great thing about it is I said, okay, as much as it pains me, I will go back and I'll give you your 30 to 50 pages. And so now what I'm doing is I'm in the process of being able to like copy some of the text that I've written here into what I'm calling chapter 4 old versus the one that I've just written. And this is the beautiful thing about the process I've done here. I'm able to pull material that I've written, copy it into a new area. And because of the methodology I've developed and the terminology that I've developed, if I want to remove a term from this new version of the book, of the chapter, I just go in here and remove that term. It automatically gets removed from this particular implementation of the book. And by the end of the weekend, I will have gone from a 100-page chapter down to the 30 pages that they want. And all of the quiz questions, all of the glossaries, and then one other thing I'll reference too. I've got another piece of code that's running on the page template that I'll show you real quick. Where's P page? I've got another thing that I figured out using Pandoc that goes through and extracts any of the citations in the page. And so then what that's happening here is my references point is pulling all of the site keys out of the work. And so that way, for that particular implementation, I'm now getting the references exported as well. So by doing that, I'm able to take all of my larger corpus of work, just grab the core consolidated pieces that I really need for that 30 page rendition of what the book needs to be, and consolidate it down. And that's probably going to take me a day or two. I'm not, I've got other stuff to prioritize, but like early mid next week, I'll be able to easily go from my 100-page chapter to a 35-ish, 45-page version of the chapter. And all of its ancillary elements of glossary, references, learning assets, learning outcomes, all of that stuff, all automatically get consolidated to as an automated positive byproduct of the effort. As opposed to if you were doing so in the linear Google document version of the book, you copy and paste a section of the book. And that's what I was talking with I wish I needed my co-author to do more of this. But I'm like, look, this mobile ecosystem section, one way I can reduce the size of chapter 4 is move this whole section into chapter 2. And as soon as I get her successfully on using Tinderbox thoroughly, we'll do that. And with that too will come all of the glossary and references and all of the other ancillary things that are associated with that automatically, and they'll all automatically get referenced and renumbered to chapter 2. And all the figure numbers will automatically get re-referenced to chapter 2. And I've just sucked 20 pages out of chapter 4 and put them into chapter 2. It's just this whole CSA, 5 C's of knowledge management, CSA separation model, once you actually start grokking it, just is so terribly efficient. And then one of the things that I've ultimately then finally learned here, work is work. And the question is, where do you want to do that work? Do you want to do it downstream in the output software and spend your time and energy doing things, redoing things and messing around with things and playing with the appearance, where you're really not truly creating knowledge value? You're just working in the processes and the workflow to which the tool dictates to you. Or do you want to do the work in the early part of the stream? And in that process, you're like, but I don't want to learn HTML. I don't want to learn CSS. I don't want to learn regex. But here's the thing. If you take the time to learn those things, you're learning computing, you're learning how to get closer to your data, and then you're also giving yourself the affordance of all of this efficiency, of all of this learning, all of this reproducibility. But what you're also doing is you're making at the downstream the editorial process so much simpler, because the editors then are going to have to wade through piles and piles and piles of artifact redline that actually don't need to be there at the end of the day in that output. So you're not only saving yourself time, your future self effort in the future, you're saving editorial effort in the future. And then Mark Anderson and I were talking about on Thursday, this really helps you start distinguishing too between the difference of copy editing versus knowledge editing. And what this allows you to do is do all of your knowledge editing in a tool like Tinderbox, where that editing process really helps you with the creative knowledge. And then when you get the stuff in the final output solid framework, it leaves then just a simple copy editing. Well, you got a typo here. This little part really should move up there. Let's change that color, which is something you'll never get away from. So that's a lot of the work that I was playing with last week and kind of refining this process. Let me again pause there and see if anybody have any thoughts, comments, questions. Ideas, Mark, you want to reflect?
I like Mark's comment in the sidebar that learning is investment. One thing I would actually I was thinking when you mentioned sort of about learning, sounds a great throwaway line, just learning regex or something. Of course, arguably one never learns regex. There's always one more thing to learn. But I think the subtle part of it is that if you're open to the idea of knowing enough about it to have a sensible conversation with someone who is actually skilled in it, it makes it much easier to go to some of the public fora where you might need to go to somewhere other than here to ask for help or guidance.
Well, like how many times have I called you at 3 in the morning my time and said, dude, I can't figure this regex out, and then you just need another brain, and like you and I 30 minutes later, like here it is, yeah.
But the key point there is it's not that one, in terms of learning it, it's not that one knows every nuance of HTML or every nuance of regex. It's more that getting yourself to the point that is not scary to consider even looking at the thing, to be able to understand, to make it easier for someone to help you. Say, okay, fine, look, I fixed it. I changed this bit, and this bit, and you say, okay, you can see it's there, and you can feel comfortable with what's being done. So it doesn't actually require as much learning as the statement might require. Is what I guess I'm saying. I see Peter has his hand up.
Yeah, Peter, go for it.
Okay, I have more of an upstream question, so sort of changing topics. But I found a couple old jump drives, and they have no directory structure in them whatsoever. They're simply just flat dumps of web archives and PDF files that I'd been downloading a few years ago. And I'm thinking, gee, I should really maybe make proxies for each of them in Tinderbox and try to organize it there, but I'm not sure how to start and tackle it. So basically, again, I have no idea really what the stuff is. Basically, anything that I thought maybe like 5, 6 years or so ago when I dumped all this stuff onto the jump drive was interesting, I threw it all on the drive. No structure whatsoever. Just this vast sea of hundreds and hundreds of web archives and PDF files, all jammed filling the drive stick up.
So if I were you, Peter, what I would do is I would basically right mouse click on all the items in the drive, copy those, copy those into a spreadsheet, or find a way. And again, I'm riffing right now, but there's a method here. Copy the item names, copy the item paths, copy all of those over into Tinderbox, populate the item paths with the file attribute, copy the file name with the name of the file, including its extension, and then possibly think about this as kind of qualitative data analysis. You'll want to then have some attributes that you'll use to tag those items, like this article is related to this is a book, this is an article, this is a video, whatever that might be. And then you can just start deconstructing it. And then from there, you then can use all of the affordances of the Tinderbox views to make that more readily available to then sort and filter and have agents that say, just go find me the books, just go find me the articles. And you might want to use table view or attribute view, as Mark Bernstein was suggesting earlier, to be able to line those attributes up next to each other. So that, and then Mark just put it in the text, run ls to get the file name path. That's pretty cool. So you grab all the file names, stick those into the text of the book, then run this text equal run ls. That will give you the file paths. So yeah, just and then you just do a qualitative data analysis process. And that would be really, really slick. Does that make sense?
Yep.
In this case, the files themselves are unlikely to be mostly Greek to you. You saved them for some reason only a few years ago. So this feels like a classic card sorting technique. A problem that user experience people have come up with to establish, in this case, people's priorities, but which is also useful for finding out categories. So start with, once you've got the list, start with the first one and the second one and see if they fit together, or they obviously fall in two different categories that you can name, like research papers and junk. And if they don't, just keep going until you find two that have something in common. Make a container, put them both in the container, and proceed. After a while, you'll get a sense of whether the categories you're building up are useful or not. Doesn't have to be a taxonomy. It can be like the classic recent news, big things, things with a pigeon, things about children, things too old to think about. But that gives you a categorization, which will reduce hundreds of things into 10 categories of tens of things. And tens of things are much easier to think about.
Okay, that gives me a good start. Thanks a lot. That helped.
All right. We've got about 7 minutes left. Unfortunately, we're not going to get to the qualitative data analysis of images. So we can do that later. One other thing before I forget, I'm so excited about it. I just got to tell everybody. So I will not be at the next couple of meetups because I am going to be at the Bhutan Innovation Forum on October 1st through 3rd. And on October 30th, when I land, or the day after I land, I am going to be visiting the Tiger's Nest. And then from the 4th through the 11th, I will be doing a 70-mile trek through the Himalayas with me, a guide, and a horse. So I will not be around for a couple weeks, but I will see you all when I get back, and I will report
Exciting.
on how it went. Yeah, I'm really excited. It's gonna be awesome.
Catch a photo of a Yeti for me.
Yeah, actually, you're not the first person that's asked me to ask the Sherpas about, like, let's go find a Yeti. Yeah. So that'll be fun. Any other, so no necessarily need to jump on and start a new topic now with 6 minutes left. Do we have any other reactions, thoughts to the broad spectrum of stuff we talked about today?
One thing I want to
to
mention quickly from the beginning. You asked about things learned. There was a wonderful keynote by Kathy Marshall, who reprised and extended her Tinderbox meetup talk from about a year ago. And I believe that's going to be posted online. And it's a wonderful look, not so much at tools for thinking as research and thinking, taking actual people who are not that long ago and trying to figure out what they were actually doing, which is not necessarily what everyone thought they were doing.
Well, and honestly, if you remember that, and maybe while I'm talking, Mark, if you can possibly pull our answer, if you can find that session from the complete videos from last year, that was a great talk, because if you remember, what she was doing is deconstructing photos. And she was like, and when she was talking, I don't remember the name of the person she was discussing, but she was saying, everyone interpreted this photo differently. And I, through my research and sleuthing, have realized we completely misinterpreted this photo. And this is what I believe this photo really means. And when you understand it within that context, holy wow, this is different. And I found that whole discussion really inspiring. So I'm glad you brought that back up, because that actually does conclude our talk on qualitative data analysis of images as a really nice anchor point for that. Yeah, that was a fun one. Let me see if I can find that talk.
I've got it.
All right, cool.
Sorry about that.
Awesome. Yeah, that's it. Yeah. Okay. We've got 4 minutes left. Oh, there was one other thing I could say too. And hopefully it's. Do you mind if I bring a little bit of? I guess you don't mind. I'll do it anyway. So in the backstage, I had and now this is a a testament to the greatness of Tinderbox, but it's more of an advanced activity that we wouldn't necessarily recommend for the, I don't want to say the faint of heart because it's really not that big of a deal, but it's really the coolness of this tool called Tinderbox that is fascinating. So one of the things that I was finding with this whole discussion with my publisher and all of that was one of the interesting things with aliases, for example, is the alias perfectly aligns to its original note. So you get inheritance between the alias and the original note, and any changes you make in the alias, those changes immediately affect the original note, which is great, and that's perfectly how they're designed, and it's awesome. But this idea of inheritance in Tinderbox, I think, is really crucial in that, you know, it creates so much affordance so that, you know, when you modify one note, any aliases associated with that, all of them get done or get implemented. But I found one use case, or a use case that I needed for myself, was what would happen if I had a term that happened to be referenced in multiple chapters of a book, and yet in one chapter I decided I did not want it to I did not want that term to be represented, but in other chapters I still wanted them to be represented, but I wanted to be able to manipulate that decision on the alias of the note, not on the original note itself. And so this is like, you know, I couldn't figure it out. I posted it in Backstage, and Mark Anderson came up with this brilliant solution, and let me show you what happens. So I'll show you the output, and then we'll show you the answer for it. So, and this is another one of my reasons why I love Tinderbox so much, is that the backend file is actually, unlike a Word file or other output type software, which is so convoluted and messy, Tinderbox is essentially just an XML file that you can play around with if you're not if you have the desire to do so. So let me demonstrate it. So let's say in this particular implementation of the chapter, so I'm gonna render the glossary, and all of the terminology shows up in the glossary. But now let's say, you know what? I don't want the term A to P in this context to actually show up in the glossary. So I'm going to uncheck, even though I still want it associated with, I still want the linking with the other chapter, with the other notes within this chapter, because there's an association there that I want to keep, but I don't actually want it in the output. So if I check this is no include report Boolean that I created, normally that would also check that box on the main note, but in this case it doesn't. So the great thing about this is, so now if I go look at the actual glossary, you notice the glossary now gets rendered without that. And if I uncheck it again, you'll note that I re-render the glossary, and now it's back. So how did we do that? So if I go and open the let me find the file. If I go and open up the XML of Tinderbox, so if you just open up a Tinderbox file using a text editor like BBEdit, and then I'll do a search on that attribute is, what did I call it again? Is no include report. So if I search on that attribute, right now, in doing this, by the way, if you're going to mess around with the XML of your Tinderbox file, no harm, no foul, but please, 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 please make a copy of it first if you're not used to doing this. Because you'll invariably screw up your file if you do something, and you'll have to send it to Mark, and Mark will have to fix it for you. But if you just create a copy of your file and you've got a backup, you can go around and mess with it as much as you want. So what Mr. Mark Anderson found for me is we were actually able to put in this value, can inherit equals 0. And so that actually flagged this attribute as not being inherited between notes. And so that allowed me to create a non-inheritable attribute for a Tinderbox, for an alias, so that I can now toggle and on and off the visibility of that term showing up in the glossary or not. And again, I know of no other software that would give us this kind of flexibility to be able to do this kind of thing in the moment. And again, that could, I could maybe one day that shows up in the UI or not, but there's so many other considerations to consider to make that work. But how cool is this that we have software that allows us to have this level of nuanced control? I just think it's awesome. So that was something else we discovered in the last week or so. So thank you, Mr. Bernstein, for that, because it's saved my bacon, is giving me hours, and it's reducing hours and hours of grief on how to run around and do that. So that's pretty cool. All right, we're about 2 minutes over. Anybody else have any other thoughts, comments, ideas, questions? If not, we will wrap up today and call it a day.
Thanks, Al.
Okay, and I'll see you all in about 2.5, 3 weeks. Have fun while I'm gone.
Enjoy
yeah,
Bhutan.
Peter, you had
Be
a question?
safe.
Were you waving, or did you have a question?
Just wishing safe travels for you.
Oh, thanks very much. Okay, see y'all. Bye-bye.
Be safe.